I've talked about indie games on this channel quite a bit. In my video on Fez, I talked about how indie games are a special breed of game because when you think about it, they're the gold example of a passion project. Indie developers pour their blood, sweat, and tears into making these games because, above all else, they believe in the game that they're making. That's why the story of Hyper Light Drifter's creator, Alex Preston, is so befitting of an indie game developer. He was born with a congenital heart disease, and much of his inspiration for Hyper Light Drifter came from his experiences and challenges he had to overcome in his life. It's so awesome to hear about developers' backstories because it really does give context to why their games are the way they are. In my opinion, having some idea of the people behind the games we play is instrumental in having a greater understanding and appreciation of their work. Knowing why Preston, someone with a terminal disease, made a game where the player character is someone with a terminal disease adds a lot to my regard for this game. I don't know how else to explain it other than it kinda almost makes me feel closer to the game in a sense. I bring all of this up because, just like its creator, Hyper Light Drifter is unique. What it brings to the table isn't necessarily earth-shattering or brand new, but it instead takes the best aspects of its inspirations and combines them seamlessly. That may not sound particularly unique on the surface, but what really pulls the game together is its atmosphere. In a word, Hyper Light Drifter is oppressing. I could probably make an entire video about its opening cutscene alone. It wordlessly communicates to the player that the world they're about to step into has been rocked by some catastrophic force, and that the main character is afflicted by a nightmarish disease that seems to follow him everywhere. This scene also says a lot about the world of the game. The Drifter runs up a flight of stairs to see these enormous titans screaming in agony and then decaying away. He meets a jackal who leads him to a gate that swallows him whole and teases what seems to be the cure to his disease right in front of him as he's being swallowed by whatever shadowy force is holding him captive. The music in this opening scene is so loud and foreboding, and it sounds like an animal scratching at the walls of its cage trying to get out. It instills so much anxiety and makes me feel uncomfortable. I love the scene so much because it doesn't hesitate to communicate to the player the game's themes and atmosphere. It's abstract and can probably be interpreted in many ways. It sets the tone for the rest of the game. The story of Hyper Light Drifter is one that's hard to talk about, because the story itself is incredibly obtuse in the best way possible. The game contains zero dialogue, and the NPCs in the world instead communicate via images inside of speech bubbles. This makes the story hard to interpret, because the NPCs could be saying anything. I'm personally a fan of this because it almost makes it feel like there's more story than there actually is. What I mean by this is that while exposition and dialogue may be non-existent, the fact that what little communication received by the player can be interpreted in so many ways makes it so that each player could end up having a unique perspective of what kind of story the game is trying to tell, and I think that's really cool. The obvious downside to this is that means that there really isn't an official or canon version of the story, unless you want to count whatever it was that the developers themselves were trying to say through the story. The overworld of Hyper Light Drifter is divided into 5 distinct regions: a central village that contains shops and minigames, the snowy mountains inhabited by anthropomorphic bird wizards to the north, a forest infested with huge green crystals and inhabited by dog-like samurai to the west, a watery pier overrun with ninja frogs to the east, and a desert inhabited by evil robots to the south. There's also the final area located under the village that contains the final boss, but I don't really count it as a true area because the final boss is the only notable thing there. This might sound a bit weird, but the layout of Hyper Light Drifter's overworld seems a little too gamey for my tastes. What I mean is that when I said the overworld is divided into 5 distinct regions, I really meant it. They don't really blend into each other at all. They kinda just jut out from the central village and that's how you get to them. They're not interconnected in any way I know of, so you can't travel between them without having to go through the central village. The world's inhabitants and the remnants left over from whatever apocalyptic event occurred makes the world itself feel believable. It's just the way everything is laid out just doesn't feel like it's all there. If you look at a game like A Link to the Past, its overworld also feels a little sectioned off, but the difference to me is that most of the world is thematically similar. Aside from Death Mountain and the desert in the southwest, the whole world shares a similar green color palette and it feels like you're roaming through a countryside. Plus, the path to each major area gradually leads to its corresponding area, like how the marsh is just west of Lake Hylia, or how you start to see more houses dotted about leading up to Kakariko Village. It also helps that there isn't some central hub that connects everything together. The world more or less flows into itself, if that makes any sense. The difference with Hyper Light Drifter is that each area is thematically different from one another and are only connected by a central hub. I think this could have had a pretty simple fix. The locations of each major region can stay the same, just simply have a bigger central area that can still act like a hub, but feel organic enough that the fact that it's a central hub is hard to notice. Another issue I have related to the overworld is the world map. It's extremely vague and it only shows which screen you're on, not where in the screen you are. On top of that, which screen you're even on isn't even clear, so navigating the world based on the map isn't really useful. You'll have to rely more on your environmental awareness to explore more than anything, which seems like a good thing, but to me, I think it's more of a potential positive born out of a definite negative, so I'm not entirely sure how I feel about that. I think having a minimap would have been really helpful and would have made up for the general overworld map being really vague. Oh, also, one minor complaint I have is that I don't really understand why the southern area was locked until you beat the other 3 areas bosses. It really doesn't have any difference in difficulty other than the extra mini-bosses located throughout it, so I'm not too sure why that is. While I may take issue with some of the aspects of the overworld, the actual world the game portrays is fantastic and very believable. There's so much world building and subtle details that make the game feel so alive. There are unique factions for each region of the game, and how they came to be is usually explained by other NPCs through their quote-unquote speech bubbles. I've already talked about the opening cutscene quite a bit, but that alone does so much world building. Subtext is really important to this world because even though the game can more or less explicitly explain certain things, there are others that have to be inferred, like how after defeating each boss, the Drifter is haunted by whatever creature is supposedly causing his illness. The game never really tells you why that happens so often, and more importantly, we never really get a real explanation as to what this disease actually is or what's causing it. The only hint we get is that there's another Drifter you meet occasionally who seems to have the same illness. The world of Hyper Light Drifter is so intelligently designed and has so much nuance and, there's that word again, atmosphere. It's so incredibly believable and well executed, and I believe it to be one of the strongest, if not the strongest aspect of the game. A fantastic aspect of the overworld is the abundance of secrets. Scattered about are these little symbols on the ground that indicate that there's a secret nearby. They strike a good balance of not being overly obvious while still retaining some subtlety because they're colored to blend in with the ground. Secrets generally lead to either gear bits, modules, monoliths, or keys. And these secrets aren't just some silly thing to do for fun. The rewards are very real and incredibly useful. Collecting 4 gear bits creates 1 gear bit pack, which are used to buy new weapons and upgrades from the shops in the village. Collecting at least 4 modules in a specific region allows the player to access the boss of the region, while collecting 4 more opens up an extra area that contains more gear bits and other items. Finding all 16 monoliths throughout the world unlocks a special outfit that increases your max health. Finding certain amounts of keys allow you to unlock doors which contain many different things, so I won't go through the process of naming them all here. All I'll say is that they're worth going for. Searching for secrets is incredibly satisfying because you don't necessarily need to be a genius to find a lot of them, but you still need to be observant and vigilant when it comes to it. Secrets serve as huge motivation for the player to explore. The rewards are so immediate. Have enough gear bit packs to get a new upgrade, the shops are just 1 teleport away. Find 4 modules, you can now either head straight for the boss or try to find the other 4 for even more rewards. As a side note, modules are often found outside of secrets in that the world design leads you to them naturally. This works twofold as you can either follow the quote-unquote designated path to the modules or you can find some of the more elusive ones at your leisure. It's an extra bit of player agency and it's much appreciated. Another quote-unquote collectible item is health packs, which heal you and are found scattered in many areas. I put collectible in quotes because they respawn, but still require a similar level of observation in order to find them and are equally satisfying to pick up. Exploration is such an integral part of the game, and the fact that it's done as well as it is speaks volumes to how carefully crafted this game is. Satisfaction is another key element to what makes Hyper Light Drifter work. Satisfaction comes in many ways. A very subtle but fantastic addition is a slight amount of what I like to call hit lag whenever you hit something with your sword or gun. If you're familiar with fighting games, you'll understand what I mean by this, but for those who don't, hit lag essentially refers to a very brief freeze frame that occurs when something is hit. So, for instance, slashing an enemy or a box with the sword will trigger this hit lag effect, and what it does is add a little crunch to the combat, if that makes any sense. It's hard to describe if you haven't actually played the game. It's such a small detail, but it makes such a huge difference in the overall feel of the gameplay. Satisfaction also comes in the form of the game making you feel like a total badass. A perfect example of this is that there are some points of the game when you're locked in a room and you have to kill all the enemies before you can proceed. This is pretty standard fare in a lot of action games, but what makes these rooms so fun is that they're challenging. One of my favorite examples of this is one where you're in a large room that has a ton of things going on at once. There's enemies shooting rockets at you, stationary turrets firing, and huge waves of weak enemies with some stronger ones thrown in, and you have to kill all of them without dying. There are 1 or 2 health packs strewn about, but that creates an interesting choice in whether or not you should go get them, because stopping for even a few seconds could result in death. Overcoming a challenge like this is rewarding enough, but then once it's over you get this brief animation of the Drifter spinning his sword around and then thrusting it into the ground. Hyper Light Drifter has endless amounts of little moments and details like this, and naming them all in one video would be impossible. And that leads me to the crown jewel of the game, the combat. Hyper Light Drifter was made to be an action game, and not only does it deliver on that promise, it knocks it out of the park. The combat in the game is designed around 3 central mechanics: the sword, the gun, and the dash. In order to regain ammo for your guns, you have to hit an enemy with your sword, and putting yourself in melee range is often dangerous, so you can dash away to safety. All combat scenarios incorporate these 3 mechanics in some significant way. Each mechanic complements the other in equal measure, and the dynamic they create always feels interesting and practically never got stale. It just feels natural. One reason for this is that the actual act of fighting enemies is so smooth and intuitive. Like so many other aspects of this game, it feels like the combat was very carefully crafted in order to be as fluid and enjoyable as it is. The hit lag I described earlier is one reason I believe this, but the other is the variety of enemies and how they're grouped together in order to create interesting combat scenarios. Each enemy has a predictable way in which they act so that they can reliably be worked around at any moment, but put them into a group with enemies that behave in a complementary way, or with certain environmental hazards like gaps or explosive barrels, and now suddenly it takes way more thought and decisiveness in order to defeat them. Combat just feels awesome in this game, and it gets even better once you start buying upgrades that augment your abilities. You can dash and shove an enemy into a wall, you can reflect projectiles with your sword, you can get a charge attack like in Zelda, the list goes on. Which power-ups you choose to get have a dramatic effect on combat, for better and for worse. The difficulty curve gets put in a weird spot with these power-ups. In addition to gaining new abilities, you can increase your gun's ammo capacity and how many health packs you can hold at a time. Upgrades like this are always a tricky thing to balance because on one hand, upgrades are a great way to incentivize exploration and they add variety to the combat, but if the upgrades are too powerful, then the difficulty curve the designer carefully created could be jeopardized. The ability to store additional health packs is probably the most dangerous upgrade to include from a design standpoint, because a significant part of the difficulty of the game comes from being careful in combat because you can only carry so many health packs, and you don't know when you'll find another. Being able to carry more than 3 health packs pretty much nullifies that aspect of the game and removes some of the risk and tension from crawling through a dungeon, especially in New Game Plus where you only have 2 health instead of 5. But it could be argued that this is okay because it offsets some of the difficulty that arises from your reduced health. Some of the upgrades feel a little too strong at times too, like how if you use it at just the right angle, the dash attack can do 5 damage to an enemy, which insta-kills some of them. Ultimately, whether you choose to use the upgrades or not is a choice, so at least it's not forced on you. Personally, if I were designing the game, I would have not included any upgrades at all, and instead made the combat more focused around working with the environment that enemies are placed in order to beat them. But then other things like the gear bits would have less importance, which affects other things, and so on. Game design isn't easy, I get that. And maybe what I'm suggesting goes against what the designers were trying to go for, so ultimately this is all just my opinion. While I have almost nothing but praise for the standard enemies, I do take some issue with how the bosses are handled. Each region has a major boss, and except for the western one, all the bosses feel kinda lackluster, including the final boss. The western boss stands out to me because of its difficulty and attack patterns. Like many of the normal enemies, the western boss has several predictable patterns that can be worked around, only they're much more difficult to handle and there are quite a few of them. He's pretty hard to take down, and when you do, you really feel like you accomplished something big. I really can't say that for the rest of the bosses, and I recognize that difficulty is in at least some part subjective, so you may disagree with me on this. The worst boss in the game by far is the eastern one. I literally, and I kid you not, beat it in exactly 24 seconds on the first try, which I'm showing on screen right now. And I wouldn't agree with the idea that it's supposed to be the easy boss, because all regions but the southern one are available to explore from the start, so it's not like the game is supposed to have a specific difficulty curve. If the developers wanted a sense of openness in where the player could go, they should have balanced the first 3 bosses to be roughly the same difficulty as each other. Otherwise, there should have just been a linear path that the player takes so that the difficulty can scale appropriately. That could have worked just as well. The other bosses feel sporadic and kinda luck-based. Now when I say luck-based, I mean that you don't have to be as careful to defeat them like you do with the western boss. I didn't feel like I needed to be as strategic with them. I think there are aspects of Hyper Light Drifter that don't quite reach their potential. The bosses, of course, are one of them, as well as the overworld. But let's talk about some of the things that the game manages to do so well that I haven't already. First and foremost, the art direction. It's beautiful. The cutscenes are gorgeous, the backgrounds look amazing, each character sprite is detailed and unique, the color palettes for each area are bright and vivid, the particle effects are so detailed that they just seamlessly blend in with what you're doing. I don't know what else to say other than that. The visuals of Hyper Light Drifter are absolutely fantastic. The game is also so minimalistic. The visuals are, like I said, gorgeous, but they're also so simple. The UI is simple and clean, and it actually goes away if you don't lose any health or ammo for a certain amount of time, so you could just see the game without anything else in the way. And the soundtrack, my god, the soundtrack. Disasterpeace, who, funny enough, also composed Fez, absolutely knocks it out of the park with this soundtrack. And just the sound design in general. It fits the game so well, it's so beautifully haunting and captures the atmosphere of the game so gracefully that it feels just as important to the game as anything else, and I can't say that about many other games. And overall, the game just feels so fluid to play. The controls are precise, the combat is intuitive, the game is just so polished and well made. I'm probably going to sound like a broken record at this point, but I love indie games. They really are one of a kind, and it makes me so happy that they're doing better than ever. Not only is Hyper Light Drifter getting what seems to maybe be a sequel, but it's also getting a whole animated show made by the same people who did the Castlevania show, which is absolutely crazy to me, especially because I remarked in my notes for the game that I would love to see a show themed after it. I love this game, and if you're an indie fan, you owe it to yourself to give it a try. It's one of a kind, and I love it a lot.